Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Standing in the meatpacking district along Gansevoort Street, the Whitney Museum of American Art feels deeply connected to the city around it. The building opens outward, to the High Line, to the Hudson River, to the streets of downtown Manhattan. Designed as a space for living artists and evolving ideas, the Whitney isn't just about preserving history, it's about capturing the present moment as it unfolds. And nowhere is that more visible than in the Whitney Biennial. Since its founding in 1932, the Biennial has been one of the most important surveys of contemporary American art. It's a pulse check on what artists are thinking, feeling, and creating right now. Each edition reflects a different moment in time, and the 2026 Biennial feels especially charged. This 82nd edition is curated by Marcela Guerrero and Drew Sawyer, two curators known for their rigorous and thoughtful exhibitions. Over the course of more than a year, they traveled extensively, visiting studios, meeting artists, and engaging in hundreds of conversations. What emerges is not a fixed narrative, but something more fluid, a constellation of voices, perspectives, and experiences. Rather than organizing the exhibition around strict themes, Guerrero and Sawyer focus on mood and atmosphere. The Biennial becomes something you feel as much as you see. As you move through the galleries, there's a shifting emotional landscape. Tension, tenderness, humor, unease, all existing at once. The exhibition brings together 56 artists, duos, and collectives, spanning generations and geographies. Some are based across the United States, while others live and work internationally, reflecting the expanded and complex nature of what American art means today. A central idea running through the Biennial is the concept of relationship, what it means to be connected. This shows up in many forms: familial ties, cultural identities, political entanglements, and even relationships between humans and non-human life. The works explore how we exist within systems, social, technological, ecological, and how those systems shape the way we live and interact. As you walk through the exhibition, you begin to notice how artists are pushing beyond traditional formats. This is not just painting or sculpture, it's sound, scent, performance, installation. Some works invite you to listen closely, others surround you completely. The experience becomes immersive, almost environmental. There's also a strong presence of contradiction. One moment, you encounter works that feel playful, even humorous. The next, that same sense of lightness shifts into something darker, more unsettling. Artists are using unexpected materials and visual languages to navigate complex ideas, sometimes through softness, sometimes through confrontation. In several installations, cuteness becomes a strategy. Bright colors, soft textures, and familiar forms draw you in, but underneath, there's tension. These works challenge the way we interpret emotion, power, and vulnerability, creating a space where attraction and discomfort exist side by side. Technology and infrastructure also play a major role. Some artists explore the influence of digital systems, artificial intelligence, and online culture, examining how these forces shape identity, communication, and control. Others focus on physical infrastructures, energy, architecture, and land, revealing the invisible systems that structure everyday life. And throughout the exhibition, there's a constant return to the idea of coexistence. Not a perfect or resolved coexistence, but something more complex, more unstable. The Biennial doesn't try to give clear answers. Instead, it holds space for contradiction, for uncertainty, for multiple realities existing at once. The Whitney itself becomes part of this experience. The terraces, the open galleries, the light coming in from the river, all of it shapes how you move through the work. Even outside the museum, the Biennial extends into the city, with a billboard installation across from the entrance, reminding you that this conversation doesn't stop at the walls. What makes the 2026 Whitney Biennial so powerful is that it doesn't try to define the moment, it reflects it. It captures a world that feels in flux. A world of overlapping systems, shifting identities, and constant negotiation. And through the voices of these artists, it offers not a conclusion, but a series of encounters. Encounters that stay with you, because this Biennial isn't about resolution, it's about resonance. And as you leave the Whitney, you're left not with answers, but with a deeper awareness of the complexity of the present and the many ways artists are finding to live within it. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, Malcolm Peacock presents a sculpture that brings together endurance, history, and personal labor. Born in Raleigh and based in Brooklyn, Peacock draws inspiration from a coastal redwood tree he encountered in the Pacific Northwest. Reimagined through his own process, the sculpture's surface is composed of roughly 3,500 hand-braided strands, each one created over the course of 10 months. As a long-distance runner, Peacock approaches his work through the lens of endurance and repetition, embedding time and physical effort directly into the material. Inscribed across the surface are excerpts from the autobiographies of Frederick Douglass and Malcolm X, grounding the piece in a broader historical narrative of resilience and resistance. At the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, Peacock's work stands as both monument and meditation, linking the endurance of the body to the endurance of memory and history. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, Nour Mobarak presents a body of work that is at once intimate, physical, and deeply conceptual. Born in Cairo and working between Athens and Washington State, Mobarak creates sculptures using casts of her own body, combining resin with mycelium, the root-like structure of fungi. In works like Recto Verso, the body is reduced to form, becoming a surface through which light, color, and space are explored. In Reproductive Logistics 4, a cast of her pregnant body transforms into a reflective structure that mirrors and distorts the surrounding environment, turning the viewer into part of the work. Alongside this, her sound piece broadcast, montage, layers recordings captured from within her own body, blending personal, medical, and everyday sounds into something both raw and immersive. At the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, Mobarak's work becomes a meditation on creation itself, where biology, technology, and lived experience converge, and where the body is both subject and instrument. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, Precious Okoyoman presents a haunting and deeply symbolic installation that confronts history, identity, and memory. Born in London and based in Brooklyn, Okoyoman creates sculptural environments that merge beauty with discomfort. In Everything Wants to Kill You and You Should Be Afraid, suspended figures made from taxidermied bird wings and discarded children's toys hang in space. Angel-like yet unsettling, referencing the history of racial violence in the United States. Alongside these forms, the artist incorporates altered dolls, combining vintage bunny suits with blackface doll heads, creating objects that sit at the intersection of innocence and harm. These figures blur the line between play and punishment, life and death, object and subject. At the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, Okoyoman's work becomes a powerful meditation on contradiction, holding grief, history, and resilience in a space that is as poetic as it is unsettling. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, the work of Agosto Machado brings a deeply personal and communal history into focus. Born and based in New York, Machado came of age in the 1960s and described himself as a street queen, living at the intersection of performance, survival, and chosen family. During the height of the AIDS crisis, he became a caregiver and an unofficial archivist, preserving the lives and memories of those around him. His shrines and altars, created from collected materials, are acts of remembrance and gratitude, honoring the love, resilience, and loss within his queer community. At the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, Machado's work stands as both memorial and celebration, reminding us that history is not only recorded, it is cared for, held, and lived. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, Akira Honda brings a powerful historical work into the present with a renewed sense of urgency and resonance. Born in Japan and based in Mito, Honda is known for exploring sound as a medium of memory, place, and collective experience. In this biennial, they present Ugnayan, 1974, by José Maceda, a groundbreaking composition designed for 20 radios. Originally broadcast across Manila, the piece used layered recordings of voices, gongs, and traditional Filipino bamboo instruments, transmitted simultaneously through radio stations to fill the city with sound. Rather than isolating music within a concert hall, it transformed everyday life into a shared listening experience. At the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, Honda's presentation reactivates this work for a contemporary audience, reminding us that sound can connect communities, occupy space, and reshape how we experience the world around us. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking into the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you begin to notice how many artists are trying to visualize systems, things we don't always see, but that shape how we live. Energy, environment, technology, and human activity all come into focus across the exhibition. Akira Ikezoe's paintings take that idea and turn it into something both intricate and immersive. At first glance, his works feel like abstract compositions, dense, circular, and filled with movement. But as you spend time with them, they begin to unfold as systems. There's no clear beginning or end. Instead, your eye moves continuously, following paths that loop, intersect, and expand. They feel alive. Within these circular worlds, Ikezoe introduces a range of energy sources. The sun, nuclear power plants, even methane produced by cow waste. These elements might seem unrelated, but in his paintings, they exist within the same network. Energy flows between them, transforms, circulates. And what emerges is a kind of visual ecology, one where human-made systems and natural processes are inseparable. There's something almost diagrammatic about the work, but it resists being read in a fixed way. Ikezoe doesn't present a scientific model or a clear explanation. Instead, he creates his own imaginative logic, a system that feels intuitive rather than analytical. That openness is important, because it allows you to engage with the work on multiple levels. You can follow the lines, trace the movement, get lost in the detail, or you can step back and feel the overall rhythm, the sense that everything is connected, constantly in motion. Within the Whitney Biennial, this approach resonates deeply. This exhibition is focused on relationships between people, systems, and the environments we inhabit. Ikezoe's paintings visualize those relationships in a way that feels both complex and accessible. They remind you that energy is not something distant or abstract. It's part of everyday life. It moves through landscapes, through technology, through the body, through the world. And by placing all these elements within a continuous circular structure, Ikezoe suggests that nothing exists in isolation. Everything is part of a larger cycle. The Whitney space enhances this experience. Standing in front of these works, you feel drawn in, almost pulled into the system itself. The scale, the detail, the movement of the compositions create a sense of immersion, even within a static painting. And as you move through the biennial, that idea stays with you. Because Ikezoe's work doesn't just show systems, it invites you to think about your place within them. Within the Whitney Biennial 2026, his paintings become a reminder that the world is not made up of separate parts, but of continuous, evolving connections that shape everything around us. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking into the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you begin to feel how deeply this exhibition is shaped by memory, by the ways artists hold on to places, moments, and experiences that continue to live within them. The Whitney, with its open galleries and shifting light, becomes a space where these personal histories unfold alongside broader global narratives. Curated by Marcela Guerrero and Drew Sawyer, this biennial brings together artists whose work reflects the complexity of the present moment, one shaped by displacement, identity, and the ongoing impact of political events. It's an exhibition where the personal and the geopolitical are often inseparable. And Ali Ayal's work captures that intersection with quiet, emotional intensity. At the center of his contribution is a cityscape of Baghdad. But this is not a painting created from direct observation. It is built entirely from memory, from a moment that took place just before the Iraq War began in 2003, a moment that would mark a turning point in his life. Ayal recalls being taken by his mother, along with his two sisters, to the largest amusement park in Baghdad. It was a final visit, a way of seeing the city one last time before leaving the country, and from that memory, he constructs the painting. The perspective is striking. We see the city from a Ferris wheel, elevated above the landscape. There's a sense of distance, of looking out and taking everything in at once. The lights of the city, the structures, the atmosphere, it all feels both vivid and slightly dreamlike, as if shaped by time and emotion rather than precise detail. And within this scene there is a figure, his mother. She gestures outward toward the city, as if pointing, showing, guiding. It's a simple gesture, but it carries immense weight. It becomes a moment of connection between mother and child, between past and future, between presence and departure. There's a tenderness in that moment, but also a sense of loss, because the painting holds the awareness that this is a final view, that the city being seen is about to become memory, that what is present in that moment will soon exist only in recollection. And that is what gives the work its emotional depth. It's not just a cityscape, it's a reconstruction of a moment that can never be revisited in the same way. Within the Whitney Biennial, this resonates deeply. This exhibition is filled with artists exploring displacement, migration, and the ways history shapes personal experience. Ayal's work contributes to that conversation by focusing on memory as a form of preservation. He doesn't attempt to recreate Baghdad exactly as it was. Instead, he paints how it is remembered, and that distinction matters. Because memory is not fixed, it shifts, it softens, it emphasizes certain details while letting others fade. The painting carries that quality. It feels alive but also distant, like something just out of reach. The Whitney space amplifies this experience. Standing in front of the work, surrounded by other voices and histories, you begin to feel the layering of experiences, different geographies, different moments in time, all existing within the same exhibition. And Ayal's painting becomes a point of stillness within that movement, a moment that asks you to pause, to reflect, to consider how memory shapes the way we understand place. and what it means to carry a city within you, even after you've left it behind. Within the Whitney Biennial 2026, Ali Ayal's work becomes more than a personal story. It becomes a universal one, about leaving, about remembering, and about the quiet, powerful act of holding on to a place, even as it transforms into something that exists only in the mind. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking into the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you begin to feel how this exhibition is not just about what we see, but about how we assign meaning, value, and care to art itself. The Whitney, long engaged with the social frameworks of art, becomes a space where those questions are made visible. Curated by Marcela Guerrero and Drew Sawyer, this biennial brings together artists who are deeply aware of the systems surrounding art, its institutions, its economies, and its emotional weight, and Andrea Fraser's work speaks directly to that awareness. Fraser is known for her conceptual practice, often examining the structures that define the art world, how art is valued, how it is displayed, and how audiences engage with it. But here, in the Whitney Biennial, that critique takes on a deeply emotional and almost intimate form. Her sculptures, untitled Object IV, depict sleeping toddlers. At first, they appear quiet, almost peaceful. There's a softness to them, a sense of stillness and vulnerability. But as you spend time with the work, that calm begins to shift into something more complex. Fraser describes these figures as allegorical figures of art objects, and that idea changes how you see them. The children are not just representations of innocence or rest, they become stand-ins for artworks themselves, objects that require attention, that depend on care, that hold emotional and psychological value beyond their material form. And materially, these sculptures reinforce that idea. They are made from wax that never fully hardens. Unlike traditional sculpture, which often emphasizes permanence and durability, these works remain soft, unstable, and fragile. They cannot exist unprotected. Because of this, they are encased in plexiglass. That enclosure creates a tension. You can see them clearly, but you cannot access them. They are protected, preserved, and separated. Much like artworks in a museum, the glass becomes both a barrier and a safeguard. And within that space, the sculptures seem to ask something of you. To look, to care, to consider your own role as a viewer. Within the Whitney Biennial, this resonates deeply. This exhibition is concerned with relationships between people, systems, and structures. Fraser brings that conversation into the emotional realm, asking how art itself functions within those relationships. What does it mean to value an artwork? What does it mean to care for it? And how much of that value is shaped by the systems that surround it? These questions become even more layered through the presentation of her work alongside paintings by her mother, Carmen de Monteflores. This pairing introduces a personal dimension, mother and daughter. Two artists, two generations, presented together within the same space. It creates a dialogue not only about art, but about inheritance, of ideas, of practice, of experience. The sculptures, with their focus on care and emotional need, take on new meaning when seen in relation to this familial connection. The Whitney space amplifies this encounter. As you move through the galleries, you feel the layering of perspectives, historical, personal, institutional. Fraser's work sits within that intersection, quietly but powerfully. And what stays with you is not just the image of the sculptures, but the feeling they evoke. A sense of responsibility, a sense of vulnerability, a sense that art, like these figures, is not fixed or self-contained, but dependent on the ways we engage with it. Within the Whitney Biennial 2026, Andrea Fraser's work becomes more than a conceptual statement. It becomes a reflection on what art needs and on what it asks from all of us. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, Anna Tsoulirakis reimagines the language of monuments with humor, critique, and power. Born in Kansas and a member of the Navajo Nation in Creek, Tsoulirakis engages directly with art history, particularly the iconic sculpture End of the Trail, which depicts a Native American figure in a state of exhaustion and defeat. In response, she overturns this narrative by presenting a bold female warrior figure, armed not only with traditional weapons like spears, but also unexpected objects like a wrench, menstrual cups, IKEA furniture, and even a reference to the Elder Wand from Harry Potter. At the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, Tsoulirakis' work challenges stereotypes and reclaims representation, blending the mythical, the everyday, and the absurd to create a new kind of monument rooted in resilience, humor, and contemporary identity. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking into the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you're immediately aware that this is an exhibition built on transformation of materials, of meaning, of the systems that shape everyday life. The Whitney itself, open to the city and grounded in the present, becomes a space where these transformations unfold in real time. Curated by Marcela Guerrero and Drew Sawyer, this biennial doesn't follow a fixed narrative. Instead, it moves through mood, through atmosphere, through relationships, between people, technology, ecology, and history. It's an exhibition that asks you not just to look, but to feel how art operates within larger systems. And Ash Arter's work sits right at the center of that conversation. Her installation Consumables immediately draws you in with something familiar. A refrigerator. But this is not just an everyday object. It's powered by solar panels located outside the museum, directly linking the work to energy systems, to sustainability, to the invisible infrastructures that support daily life. Inside the refrigerator, you encounter something unexpected. Cadillac hood ornaments, symbols of luxury, stability, and industrial power, are recreated in materials like butter, shea butter, and chocolate. These are substances that nourish, that melt, that decay. They are temporary, fragile, and deeply physical. There's a tension here that you can't ignore. On one hand, you have the imagery of permanence, automotive emblems tied to industry, legacy, and status. On the other, you have materials that are perishable, that resist longevity, that exist in a constant state of change. And that contrast becomes even more personal. Arter modeled these objects after a keepsake hood ornament from her late father's car. He worked for General Motors, the parent company of Cadillac. So within this industrial symbol, there's also memory, family, and inheritance. The work becomes both intimate and systemic at the same time. You're not just looking at sculpture, you're looking at a layered reflection on labor, legacy, and value. And then there's the element of time. Because these materials won't remain the same. They soften, they shift, they break down. The work exists in a state of transformation, reminding you that even the most solid-seeming systems, economic, industrial, personal, are not fixed. In another work, Broadcast Number 4, Arter expands this idea even further. Here, the concept of broadcast takes on multiple meanings. An analog synthesizer emits a low, rhythmic frequency, filling the space with sound that feels almost physical. At the same time, seeds are dispersed across trays of soil. Sound becomes action. The vibration translates into movement, into growth, into something that extends beyond the gallery. These seeds can later be planted, turning the installation into a living archive, something that carries both sonic and biological information into the future. It's a powerful rethinking of communication. Broadcast is no longer just about transmitting information through media. It becomes about propagation, about life, about continuity. The work blurs the line between technology and nature, between signal and seed. And this is where Arter's work connects deeply to the Whitney Biennial as a whole. This exhibition is filled with artists exploring how systems, technological, ecological, social, shape the way we live. Arter doesn't just represent those systems, she activates them. She makes them visible, tangible and experiential. The Whitney space enhances this experience. You move between indoor and outdoor elements, between light and sound, between static objects and living processes. The museum becomes part of the work, just as the work extends beyond the museum. And as you spend time with artists' installations, you begin to feel a shift. A shift in how you understand value, a shift in how you think about permanence, a shift in how you see the relationship between human systems and natural cycles. Because in the Whitney Biennial 2026, Ash Arter's work isn't just about objects, it's about transformation. And the realization that everything we build, inherit, and depend on is always in motion. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking through the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you begin to see how technology, especially surveillance, shapes the way we look at the world. Aziz Hazara's work brings that into focus. His vivid green images are derived from night vision goggles using retinal scans and biometric data embedded within the devices. These tools, often left behind in conflict zones by foreign military forces, carry not just technical function, but history, movement, and power. Hazara transforms this data into haunting visual landscapes. The familiar green glow of night vision becomes something else, less about seeing clearly and more about questioning how vision itself is controlled. These images trace the afterlives of surveillance technologies, moving from war zones into global markets, circulating far beyond their original use. Within the Whitney Biennial, his work becomes a reflection on systems of control and visibility, asking who is seen, how they are seen, and what happens to these technologies once the conflict they were built for has moved on. And in that space, Hazara reveals that even vision is never neutral. It is shaped by power, history, and the systems that produce it. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking into the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you immediately feel that this is not a traditional exhibition. It's an environment. The space shifts from gallery to gallery, not just visually, but emotionally. Sound bleeds into image, light moves across surfaces, and the experience becomes immersive, almost cinematic. Within this atmosphere, the work of Basil Abbas and Ruan Abu Rame unfolds with quiet intensity. The Whitney Biennial has always been about capturing the present moment in American and diasporic art. In this edition, curated by Marcela Guerrero and Drew Sawyer, that moment feels especially complex, layered with questions of identity, displacement, connection, and memory. The exhibition brings together artists working across disciplines, creating a landscape defined not by fixed themes, but by mood, texture, and lived experience. And it's within this context that Abbas and Abu Rame's work becomes deeply resonant. Their installation, Until We Became Fire and Fire Us, is a 3-channel video and sound environment that draws you in slowly. At first, it feels almost fragmented, images appearing and disappearing, sounds drifting in and out, text emerging only to dissolve again. But as you stay with it, a rhythm begins to form. The artists explore what they describe as collective feelings of love and longing, emotions shaped by the ongoing erasure of land and communities in Palestine. Rather than presenting a direct narrative, they build what they call forms of hauntings. The work doesn't tell you what to think, it surrounds you with traces, with echoes, with memory that refuses to disappear. There's a layering of time throughout the installation. You see drawings made by Abu Rame's father in Jerusalem decades ago, placed alongside contemporary footage. These aren't just historical references, they feel alive, part of a continuous thread that connects past and present. The drawings carry a personal intimacy, while the moving images expand outward into landscape and collective experience. Sound plays a crucial role. Traditional songs weave through the space, blending with ambient audio and shifting tones. The sound doesn't simply accompany the visuals, it guides your emotional experience. At moments, it feels meditative. At others, it becomes heavy, almost overwhelming. You're not just watching the work, you're inside it. And then there are the images of plants. Indigenous plants that persist, that resist eradication, become a quiet but powerful presence throughout the installation. They function almost as witnesses, symbols of endurance, of continuity, of life that continues despite attempts to erase it. These images ground the work, connecting it to land, to ecology, to something deeply rooted. What makes this installation so powerful within the Whitney Biennial is how it embodies the exhibition's broader focus on relationality, on how we are connected to each other, to history, to place. Abbas and Abu Rami's work doesn't isolate individual experience. It expands it into something collective, something shared. There's also a sense of fragmentation that reflects the present moment. Nothing is linear, nothing is fully resolved. The images fade, the sounds shift, the narrative remains open, and in that openness, the work creates space for reflection, for emotion, for presence. The Whitney itself amplifies this experience. The architecture, the flow of the galleries, the movement between light and dark spaces, all of it shapes how you encounter the work. You move through the installation, not just as a viewer, but as a participant. And when you leave, the work lingers, not as a clear story, but as a feeling, a sense of memory, of absence, of persistence. Because in the context of the Whitney Biennial 2026, this installation isn't just about one place or one history, it becomes part of a larger conversation about what it means to exist, to remember, and to remain connected in a world that is constantly shifting. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking into the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you begin to feel how this exhibition moves across time, not just focusing on the present, but bringing past voices into dialogue with today. The Whitney, known for championing contemporary American art, becomes a space where histories are revisited, reframed, and reintroduced. Curated by Marcela Guerrero and Drew Sawyer, this biennial brings together artists across generations, creating unexpected connections between different moments in art history. It's not just about what is new, it's about what has been overlooked, interrupted, or left unfinished. And Carmen de Monteflores' work carries that sense of rediscovery in a powerful way. Her paintings, originally created in the late 1960s, immediately stand out through their form. These are shaped canvases, not confined to the traditional rectangle, but extending outward into space. The edges of the paintings become part of the composition, creating works that feel both structured and organic at the same time. Within these forms, bold fields of color unfold. There's a graphic clarity to the work, strong shapes, defined edges, but also a softness that comes from her process. De Monteflores always began with observation. She drew from the world around her, landscapes, family, figures, and those initial gestures remain embedded in the final work. You can feel that presence in the lines? They don't feel mechanical or rigid. Instead, they carry a sense of movement, of touch, of something observed and translated rather than constructed from a purely conceptual system. And this is where her work begins to diverge from the dominant movements of her time. While pop art in the 1960s often embraced flatness, repetition, and a kind of industrial aesthetic, de Monteflores' work remains grounded in something more personal. Her abstraction is not detached. It's connected to lived experience, to observation, to the body. There's an intimacy in that approach. But there's also a deeper story behind the work. In 1969, frustrated by the lack of opportunities for women in the art world, de Monteflores stopped painting altogether. She stepped away from a practice that was still evolving, still finding its place. Instead, she pursued a doctorate in psychology and went on to write 5 novels. That decision becomes part of how we understand the work today. These paintings are not just objects from the past. They are fragments of a trajectory that was interrupted. They carry both what was realized and what might have been. And within the Whitney Biennial, that history takes on new meaning. This exhibition is deeply concerned with systems. Who is included, who is excluded, and how those structures shape artistic visibility. By presenting de Monteflores' work now, the biennial becomes a space of re-entry, bringing her practice back into conversation with contemporary artists. That conversation becomes even more personal through the inclusion of sculptures by her daughter, Andrea Fraser, mother and daughter, 2 artists, 2 generations, 2 different practices, presented side by side. There's something powerful in that pairing. It creates a dialogue not only between forms, painting and sculpture, but between lives, between histories, between different experiences of the art world. Themes of inheritance, influence, and continuity begin to emerge. The Whitney space amplifies this encounter. As you move through the galleries, you feel the layering of time. Past and present coexist, not as separate categories, but as part of an ongoing narrative. And de Monteflores' work feels both historical and immediate. The colors still resonate. The forms still feel alive. The questions still matter. Within the Whitney Biennial 2026, her work becomes more than a rediscovery. It becomes a reminder of the artists who were overlooked, of the past that were interrupted, and of the importance of bringing those voices back into the present, where they can finally be seen, understood, and fully part of the conversation. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking into the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you're immediately aware that this exhibition is about how identities are shaped, constructed, negotiated, and constantly evolving. The Whitney itself, with its exposed materials, open floors, and visible structure, feels like an extension of that idea. It's a building that doesn't hide how it's made, and in many ways, neither do the artists inside. Curated by Marcela Guerrero and Drew Sawyer, this biennial is grounded in the complexity of the present moment. It brings together artists who are examining systems, social, cultural, economic, and asking how those systems shape the way we understand ourselves and each other. And CFGNY's work sits right at the intersection of those questions. CFGNY is a Brooklyn-based collective made up of Daniel Chu, Ten Izu, Kirsten Kilponen, and Tin Nguyen. Since forming in 2016, they've developed a practice that moves fluidly between installation, sculpture, performance, and fashion. Their work is both critical and playful, using humor and material experimentation to unpack ideas around Asian identity and global culture. At first glance, their installation in the Whitney Biennial feels almost provisional. It's built from wood boards and translucent plastic, materials you might associate with construction sites or temporary structures. There's a sense that the work is unfinished or in the process of becoming. And that's exactly the point. CFGNY uses these materials intentionally, choosing elements that are usually hidden, cleaned up, or covered over in finished architecture. By exposing them, they create a visual language that speaks to identity as something that is never fixed, something that is always being built, adjusted, and redefined. Within this structure, you encounter a series of objects that feel both familiar and strange. Porcelain sculptures are cast from the negative space between made in China dollar store items. These are objects that circulate globally, cheap, mass-produced, often overlooked. But instead of reproducing the objects themselves, CFGNY focuses on the space between them. That shift is subtle but powerful. By casting the negative space, they transform absence into presence. What is usually invisible becomes the object of attention. It's a gesture that mirrors the way certain identities are often defined, not by what they are, but by how they are perceived, categorized, or reduced. There's also a playful element in the work. A stuffed animal soft sculpture appears within the installation, adding a layer of softness, humor, and even nostalgia. But like everything in this environment, it's not just decorative, it's part of a larger conversation about consumption, production, and cultural imagery. And that conversation extends into history. CFGNY's installation considers the global systems of trade that have shaped how objects and people circulate across borders. The phrase "made in China" becomes more than a label. It becomes a marker of economic systems, labor histories, and the ways race and identity are assigned within those systems. The work asks you to think about how these categories are constructed, how they are reinforced, and how they might be reimagined. Within the Whitney Biennial, this installation resonates deeply. This exhibition is concerned with relationality, how we exist within networks of power, culture, and history. CFGNY brings those networks into focus, showing how identity is not something stable or singular, but something shaped by multiple forces at once. The Whitney's architecture amplifies this idea. The exposed beams, the industrial materials, the openness of the space all echo the unfinished quality of CFGNY's installation. You move through it not as a passive viewer, but as someone navigating a structure that is still in progress. And that experience stays with you, because CFGNY's work doesn't offer a fixed definition of identity. Instead, it reveals it as something fluid, something constructed, something always in motion. And within the Whitney Biennial 2026, that realization becomes part of a larger understanding that the systems shaping who we are not permanent. They are built, and they can be rebuilt. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial 2026, Cooper Jacoby presents Estate, a series of sculptures that blur the line between technology, memory, and human presence. Born in Princeton and now working between Miami and Paris, Jacoby transforms ordinary door intercoms into deeply conceptual objects. Each sculpture is equipped with a camera that monitors its surroundings, turning the viewer into part of the work. Embedded within these systems are reactive AI models trained on the social media posts of now-deceased creatives. Through this, the sculptures generate voices that feel like echoes of past lives, simulated memories speaking into the present. An LED screen on each piece counts the exact time since each individual's death, making absence visible while simultaneously recreating presence. At the Whitney Biennial, Jacoby's work asks a powerful question. When memory becomes data, what does it mean to truly live on? Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, David L. Johnson presents Rule, an ongoing conceptual project that directly engages with public space, authority, and visibility in New York City. Born and based in New York, Johnson's work focuses on privately owned public spaces, known as POPs, areas that appear open to the public but are governed by private rules. These spaces emerged after the city's 1961 zoning resolution, allowing developers to build taller structures in exchange for creating accessible outdoor areas. In Rule, Johnson removes the codes of conduct signs that dictate behavior in these spaces. By doing so, he reveals a critical tension. Without posted rules, those restrictions are no longer enforceable. The act is subtle, but its implications are powerful. It questions who controls public space and how authority is communicated. Within the context of the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, Johnson's work reframes the city itself as a site of negotiation where access, power, and public life are constantly being redefined. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking through the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you begin to notice how deeply this exhibition is rooted in relationships between people, memory, and even animals. Emilie Louise Gossiaux's work centers on that connection. Their installation, Kong Play, is made up of 100 hand-built ceramic sculptures, each modeled after their late guide dog, London's favorite chew toy. At first, the repetition feels playful, almost light, but as you spend time with the work, it becomes something much more emotional. For Gossiaux, London was not just a companion, but a collaborator. As London's health declined, the artist began creating these objects as a way of imagining a joyful, pleasure-filled afterlife. The act of repetition becomes a gesture of care, of devotion, of holding on to connection even in the face of loss. Within the Whitney Biennial, this work resonates as a quiet meditation on love and interdependence. A reminder that relationships extend beyond the human, and that art can become a space to honor, remember, and continue those bonds. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, Emilio Martínez Poppe presents Civic Views, a project that quietly reframes how we think about government, labor, and perspective. Born in Baltimore and based in New York, Martínez Poppe created this work by visiting more than 20 government agencies in Philadelphia, interviewing employees and photographing the views from their office windows. These images are reproduced at a 1-to-1 scale and installed at the exact height of the original windows, allowing viewers to experience each perspective as if standing in those spaces. The project draws inspiration from one of the earliest surviving photographs in the United States, taken in 1839 from a window at the U.S. Mint in Philadelphia, connecting past and present through the act of looking outward. At the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, Martínez Poppe's work transforms ordinary views into a powerful reflection on civic life, inviting us to consider how institutions are shaped not just by policy, but by the people and perspectives within them. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking into the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you quickly realize that many of the works here are not just about images, they are about histories, systems, and the stories that shape entire regions and communities. The Whitney, with its open galleries and connection to the city, becomes a space where these layered narratives unfold in real time. Curated by Marcela Guerrero and Drew Sawyer, this biennial is shaped by a sense of complexity. It brings together artists whose work reflects the entanglements of the present, political, cultural, ecological, and invites you to move through them not as fixed ideas, but as lived experiences. And Enzo Camacho and Amilien's work stands out as a powerful example of that. At first, their sculptural installation draws you in through its form. It takes inspiration from Catholic altarpieces, objects traditionally used in devotional settings, with doors that open to reveal sacred imagery. There's something familiar in that structure, something tied to ritual, to storytelling, to belief. But what unfolds inside is not a religious narrative in the traditional sense. Instead, the artists present a series of scenes that trace over a century of U.S. colonial involvement in the Philippines, alongside histories of resistance by Filipino workers and peasants. The work becomes a kind of historical archive, one that doesn't sit quietly in the past, but feels urgent and present. There's a physical interaction with the piece. Each side of the altarpiece is shown on alternating weeks, meaning the work is never fully visible at once. This creates a sense of incompleteness, of shifting perspective. What you see depends on when you encounter it. History itself becomes something partial, something that unfolds over time, and that gesture is important. Because the histories being addressed here, colonialism, resistance, labor, are not fixed narratives. They are ongoing, contested, and often fragmented. The structure of the work reflects that reality. The scenes themselves move across time. From a 1901 uprising during the Philippine-American War to a contemporary moment, a U.S. spy plane crash in 2025 that killed a water buffalo in a rural province. These events are separated by more than a century, yet they are placed side by side, revealing continuities in power, intervention, and impact. The work asks you to see these connections. To understand that history is not distant, it echoes, it repeats, it evolves. Nearby, their collages extend this exploration. These works emerge from deep research into resistance movements in the Philippines, particularly those connected to farming and land rights. The materials themselves carry meaning. Handmade paper created from plant matter and recycled materials from rural areas becomes the foundation of the work. This is not just an aesthetic choice, it's a conceptual one. The land itself becomes part of the artwork. The materials hold the physical trace of the environments and communities the artists are engaging with. Combined with watercolor, the collages feel both delicate and grounded, intimate and expansive. There's a sense of care in these works. A careful layering of history, material, and image that invites you to slow down, to look closely, to engage deeply. And within the context of the Whitney Biennial, this work resonates strongly. This exhibition is deeply concerned with relationships between nations, between systems of power, between people and land. Camacho and Lien bring those relationships into focus, showing how colonial histories continue to shape the present and how resistance continues to emerge in response. The Whitney space enhances this encounter. Moving through the galleries, you experience shifts in scale, in light, in atmosphere. And when you arrive at their work, there's a grounding, a sense of being anchored in history, even as the exhibition moves through multiple perspectives. You leave their installation with a deeper awareness of how stories are told, of whose histories are centered, and of how art can serve as a space to hold, question, and reimagine those narratives. Within the Whitney Biennial 2026, Enzo Camacho and Ami Lien's work becomes more than an installation. It becomes a living archive of resistance, memory, and the ongoing struggle to shape a different future. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, Erin Jane Nelson presents a body of work that merges sculpture, photography, and ecology. Born in Wisconsin and based in Santa Fe, Nelson creates ceramic sculptures that double as functional pinhole cameras. These handmade objects are not just artworks. They are tools for seeing. Placed directly on the ground in the desert of northern New Mexico, they remain still over long exposure periods, capturing slow, subtle transformations of the landscape. Instead of focusing on sweeping desert vistas, Nelson turns her attention to the often overlooked systems beneath our feet: soil, texture, and ecological processes that unfold quietly over time. At the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, her work invites a different kind of looking, one that is patient, grounded, and deeply attuned to the rhythms of the natural world. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, Gabriela Ruiz presents Homo Machina, Human Machine, aka Gay Machine, a bold, immersive work that merges identity, technology, and performance. Born in the San Fernando Valley and based in Los Angeles, Ruiz constructs a life-size digital console that functions as a self-portrait. Combining sculpture, video, and surveillance footage, the piece reflects on how technological systems shape visibility, labor, and control, particularly for brown bodies navigating these spaces. Drawing from early Windows-era aesthetics, Ruiz rejects the clean, minimal look of contemporary tech. Instead, she embraces color, excess, camp, and spectacle, turning the digital interface into something expressive, chaotic, and deeply personal. At the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, Ruiz's work becomes both critique and celebration, reclaiming technology as a space for identity, resistance, and self-definition. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking into the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you begin to notice how cities themselves can become symbols of power, ideology, and history. Ignacio Gatica's work centers on Sanhattan, the financial district of Santiago, Chile, a space intentionally designed to mirror Manhattan. Built in the aftermath of Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship, it reflects a moment when free market ideology, shaped by U.S.-trained economists known as the Chicago Boys, was imposed onto the country. Gatica transforms this history into an immersive installation. Through layered cityscapes, dreamlike narration, and expert interviews, he explores how Sanhattan both imitates and diverges from New York. The work feels suspended between reality and projection, between what a city is and what it is meant to represent. Within the Whitney Biennial, this piece resonates as a reflection on global systems. It asks how architecture can carry ideology, how cities can become copies, and how those copies can resist their originals. And in that space between imitation and identity, Gatica reveals something deeper, that every city holds not just buildings, but the politics and histories that shape them. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, Isabelle Frances McGuire presents an installation that merges American history, mythology, and digital culture. Born in Austin and based in Chicago, McGuire draws on iconic and often mythologized moments, from the Salem witch trials to the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln, reconstructing them through contemporary technologies. At the center of the work are three witches. Their bodies form from open-source medical 3D CT scans. While these scans reveal detailed internal structures, their outer forms remain incomplete, creating figures that feel both present and fragmented. Nearby, two Salem villagers appear as hybrid digital bodies built from character models sourced from the video game Doom. At the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, McGuire's work explores how history is constructed and remembered, blurring the line between fact and fiction, past and simulation, and asking how digital tools reshape the stories we tell about ourselves. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, Jasmine Sian presents delicate, labor-intensive works that transform everyday materials into acts of care and remembrance. Born in the Philippines and based in New York, Sion works with found materials such as deli bags, cutting intricate lace-like patterns using an X-Acto knife. These detailed structures surround painted images of animals and plants, creating compositions that feel both fragile and protective. Her process is slow and intentional, sometimes painting with brushes made of a single bristle, turning each work into a gesture of attention and respect. These pieces can function as memorials or as protective spaces, honoring the lives of the beings they depict. At the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, Sion's work invites viewers to slow down and look closely, revealing how care, precision, and material transformation can become powerful forms of connection. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, Johanna Unzueta presents a body of work that quietly bridges drawing, sculpture, and material tradition. Born in Santiago, Chile, and based between Berlin and New York, Unzueta creates works on paper using natural pigments, indigo first encountered in Guatemala, and dyes extracted from berries discovered during the pandemic. Her process connects the act of making to place, memory, and lived experience. Her drawings carry a tactile, textile-like quality, emphasizing both surface and structure. To present these works in space, she draws inspiration from simple tabletop signs, allowing the pieces to stand and be viewed from both sides, transforming flat images into sculptural forms. At the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, Unzueta's work invites a slower, more attentive way of seeing, where material, color, and form unfold through time and touch. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking through the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you become aware of how time shapes experience, how light, movement, and duration can transform the way we see a space. Jonathan Gonzalez's work captures that idea through a series of photographs that are actually stills taken from Super 8 film. The images depict the Whitney's outdoor terraces, the same spaces where dancers performed their Peace Magic Hour Golden Time. Each photograph is labeled A, B, or C, corresponding to different moments in the performance, unfolding across time. There's a quiet beauty in these images. Shot during sunset, they hold that warm, diffused light known as magic hour, a fleeting moment when everything feels softer, more cinematic. At the same time, the phrase golden time references peak television hours, linking natural light to systems of viewership and attention. Within the Whitney Biennial, Gonzalez's work becomes a meditation on time, presence, and perception, capturing not just a performance, but the atmosphere surrounding it and the way fleeting moments can be held, extended, and re-experienced. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, Jordan Strafer presents Talk Show, a cinematic work that examines media, violence, and spectacle. Born in Miami and working between New York and Athens, Strafer creates films that blur fiction and reality. Talk Show, the final chapter in her Loophole trilogy, unfolds across two timelines, the turn of the millennium in color and an imagined afterlife in black and white. Structured around the format of a talk show, the film draws from news footage, self-help media, and pop culture, exploring how narratives of violence, particularly against women, are shaped and consumed through television. At the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, Strafer's work becomes both critique and mirror, revealing how justice, trauma, and celebrity are intertwined within the spectacle of media. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, the legacy of José Maceda is brought into the present through Ognayan, 1974, presented by artist and curator Akira Honda. Born in Manila, Maceda was a pioneering composer who challenged traditional ideas of music and performance. Ognayan is a groundbreaking work designed for 20 radios, using a complex score alongside recordings of voices, gongs, and Filipino bamboo instruments. Originally broadcast across radio stations throughout Manila, the piece transformed the entire city into a shared sonic experience, bringing music out of the concert hall and into everyday life. At the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, this work resonates as both historical and deeply contemporary, inviting audiences to consider sound as a collective, public, and immersive form of connection. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking into the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you start to notice how the definition of art is expanding beyond objects on walls. The Whitney has always been a space for experimentation, but in this exhibition, that experimentation feels especially connected to the way we live today, online, in conversation, in constant streams of information. Curated by Marcela Guerrero and Drew Sawyer, this biennial reflects a moment shaped by systems, technological, social, and political. It's not just about what artists make, but how they engage with the world around them. And increasingly, that world exists not only in physical space, but in digital networks. Joshua Citarelli's work enters the biennial directly through that space. His project Doomscroll is a podcast, something that might initially feel outside the traditional boundaries of a museum. But here, it becomes a central part of the exhibition, recorded live inside the Whitney itself. The gallery transforms into a studio, and the act of conversation becomes the artwork. At first, the setup is simple. A sparse arrangement, microphones, chairs, a minimal set. It mirrors the format of the podcast as it usually exists in downtown Manhattan. But placed within the Whitney, this familiar structure takes on a new meaning. Because now, the audience is not just listening, they're present. They become part of the recording, part of the atmosphere, part of the work. Doomscroll explores online culture and politics in the 21st century, topics that shape everyday life but often feel fragmented, fast-moving, and difficult to grasp. Citarella brings these conversations into focus, creating a space where ideas can be unpacked in real time. Recent episodes have examined themes like the role of celebrity in political discourse, the psychology of liberalism, and the connections between masculinity, fitness culture, and conservatism. These are subjects that circulate constantly online, through social media, forums, and algorithm-driven feeds. But here they're slowed down, discussed, interrogated. There's something powerful about that shift, because doom scrolling is typically a passive act, endlessly consuming information, moving from one piece of content to another without pause. Citarella takes that experience and transforms it into something active, a conversation. a collective moment of reflection, and within the Whitney Biennial, this transformation becomes even more significant. This exhibition is deeply concerned with how systems influence thought, behavior, and identity. Cinderella's work operates directly within those systems, but also creates distance from them, allowing us to see them more clearly. There is also a performative aspect to the work. Each live recording becomes a unique event. The energy of the room, the presence of the audience, the direction of the conversation, all of it shapes the outcome. The podcast is not fixed. It evolves with each iteration. And that sense of unpredictability connects to the broader atmosphere of the biennial. Nothing here feels static. Everything is in motion. Ideas, identities, systems of meaning. The Whitney's architecture reinforces this experience. The openness of the space allows sound to carry, to spill into surrounding areas, blending with the movement of visitors. You might not even realize at first that you've entered a live recording, and then suddenly you're part of it. Listening, observing, participating, and that's what makes Cinderella's work so compelling. It collapses the distance between art and everyday life, between the digital and the physical, between observer and participant. Within the Whitney Biennial 2026, Doomscroll becomes more than a podcast. It becomes a lens, a way of understanding how we process information, how we form beliefs, and how we exist within a world shaped by constant connection. And as you leave the space, there's a lingering awareness that the conversations shaping our reality are happening all the time. The question is whether we're just scrolling through them or actually taking the time to listen. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, Julio Torres brings his distinct, surreal sensibility into the world of contemporary art. Born in San Salvador and based in New York, Torres is widely known for his work on Saturday Night Live, as well as his acclaimed projects like Los Spookies and Problemista. Across film, television, and performance, his work is defined by a unique blend of humor, fantasy, and emotional vulnerability. At the Biennial, Torres extends this language into a new context, where storytelling, objects, and imagination intersect. His practice often elevates the overlooked and the whimsical, turning everyday ideas into poetic, theatrical experiences. Presented within the Whitney Museum of American Art, Torres's work expands the boundaries of what contemporary art can be, merging comedy and conceptual thinking into something both deeply personal and visually imaginative. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking through the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you begin to see how materials themselves can carry history, how objects hold traces of the land they come from. Kainoa Gruspe's work is rooted in that idea. He gathers materials from sites across Hawaii that have been shaped by extractive systems, military bases, golf courses, and resorts, and brings fragments of rock, stone, and plant matter back into his studio. There, he transforms them, giving them new form and meaning. In the Biennial, these materials become doorstops. It's a simple object but deeply symbolic, something that holds space open. For Gruspe, this gesture suggests the possibility of future action, of change, of rethinking the systems that shape these landscapes. These doorstops also anchor his paintings. Their physical weight contrasts with the painting's translucent surfaces, creating a balance between movement and resistance. Fishing lures appear within the work, objects tied to both survival and deception, pointing to the layered histories of these sites, many of which were once sources of food for local communities. Within the Whitney Biennial, Gruspe's work becomes a reflection on land, extraction, and possibility, a reminder that even small fragments can carry the weight of history and the potential for something new. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking into the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you immediately feel that this exhibition is about more than just individual works. It's about how artists reshape the way we understand history, culture, and form. The Whitney itself, overlooking the Hudson River, becomes part of that experience. Open, expansive, and constantly shifting with light, it creates the perfect setting for an exhibition that is deeply engaged with the present moment. Curated by Marcela Guerrero and Drew Sawyer, the 2026 Biennial brings together artists exploring identity, memory, and connection across cultures and geographies. It's an exhibition that doesn't follow a single narrative, but instead unfolds through atmosphere, through relationships between works, and through the ways artists challenge what we think we know. And for me, encountering Kamrooz Aram's work in this context felt especially meaningful. I first learned about his work when I was in Tehran, in Iran. Being there, surrounded by the visual language of pattern, architecture, and ornamentation, gave me a different understanding of abstraction, one that exists far beyond Western traditions. So seeing his work here, in the Whitney Biennial, felt like a full circle moment. There was an excitement in recognizing that connection, and in seeing how those ideas translate into this space. Kamrooz Aram's practice challenges the way art history has traditionally been written. For a long time, Western art narratives have separated fine art from what they labeled as decorative, placing painting and sculpture at the center, while forms like carpets, ceramics, architectural design, and ornament were pushed to the margins. Aram questions that divide. His work draws directly from these histories, reclaiming them and repositioning them as central to the story of abstraction. In the Biennial, his installation creates an environment rather than a single focal point. He contributes not just individual works, but the design of the space itself. There's a painted wall he describes as a monochromatic mural, which becomes a backdrop that unifies everything around it. This gesture is subtle but powerful. Instead of isolating each artwork, the space becomes continuous. The mural doesn't compete with the objects, it holds them together. It creates a rhythm, a visual language that connects painting, pattern, and form. As you move through the installation, you begin to notice how these references unfold. There are echoes of carpets, of tiled surfaces, of architectural details, but they're not presented as direct replicas. They're translated, abstracted, reimagined. The work exists between recognition and transformation, and that in-between space is where Aram's work becomes most compelling. He's not simply referencing history, he's questioning how that history has been framed. Who decides what is decorative? Who decides what counts as abstraction? And what happens when those boundaries are removed? Within the context of the Whitney Biennial, these questions take on even more weight. This exhibition is deeply concerned with how artists relate to systems, cultural, political, historical. Aram's work fits into that conversation by challenging the systems of art history itself. He reveals how certain traditions have been overlooked, and in doing so, opens up new ways of seeing. There's also a quiet elegance to his work. It doesn't demand attention through scale or spectacle. Instead, it invites you to slow down, to look closely, to notice how patterns repeat, shift, and evolve. The experience becomes almost meditative, and the Whitney's architecture enhances that. As you move through the galleries, with light filtering in and the city just beyond, Aram's installation feels both grounded and expansive, rooted in history, but fully present in this moment. Seeing his work here, after first encountering his ideas in Tehran, creates a layered experience. It connects place to place, culture to culture, past to present. And that's what makes the Whitney Biennial 2026 so powerful. It's not just showing art, it's creating conversations across time and geography. And through artists like Kamrooz Aram, those conversations challenge us to rethink what we see, how we see it, and whose histories we carry forward. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, the grassroots film collective Kekahi Wahi, founded by Sansia Miala Shibanash and Drew K. Broderick, presents a work that blends satire, history, and resistance. Based in Hawaii, the collective creates films that center indigenous perspectives and challenge dominant historical narratives. In this biennial, their project takes the form of a satirical resistance training workout filmed on the shores of Kealakekwa Bay. This location carries deep historical weight. It was here in 1779 that the High Chief Kalani Opu'u resisted an attempted kidnapping by Captain James Cook, whose expeditions brought devastating consequences to indigenous communities across the Pacific. By placing a contemporary, almost absurd performance within this charged site, now a popular tourist destination, the work exposes the layers of history often erased or overlooked. At the Whitney Museum of American Art, Kekahi Wahi transforms humor into a powerful tool, asking viewers to reconsider how history is remembered, commodified, and lived today. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking into the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you move through a series of environments that feel both personal and expansive. The Whitney itself, open to the city, layered with terraces, light, and industrial materials, becomes part of the experience. It's a museum designed not just to display art, but to hold it in dialogue with the world outside. And within this biennial, curated by Marcela Guerrero and Drew Sawyer, that dialogue feels especially intimate. This edition brings together artists responding to a moment shaped by instability, loss, and transformation. Rather than offering clear narratives, the exhibition leans into atmosphere, into feeling. It's about how art holds memory, how it processes change, and how it reflects the fragility of the present. Kelly Akashi's work sits powerfully within this context. Her installation, Monument, Altadena, is immediately striking. At first glance, you see a structure that feels architectural, a chimney standing upright, reconstructed with precision. But as you move closer, the material shifts your perception. It's made of luminous glass brick, catching and refracting light, turning something solid into something almost ethereal. This work begins with loss. After the Eaton fire in California, Akashi's home and studio were destroyed. The chimney was the only structure left standing. What she presents here is not just a reconstruction, but a transformation of that memory. Working with a mason, she rebuilds the chimney piece by piece, but in glass, a material that holds both fragility and permanence. It becomes a monument, but not in the traditional sense. It's not about grandeur or permanence in stone, it's about vulnerability. The transparency of the glass allows light to pass through, suggesting absence as much as presence. You're looking at something that once held a home, a life, a history, and now exists as a luminous trace. There's something deeply emotional in that translation. The work doesn't dramatize the loss. It holds it quietly. It invites you to stand with it, to feel the weight of what's no longer there, while also recognizing what remains. Nearby, Inheritance Distressed offers a different but connected gesture. Here, Akashi takes something incredibly delicate, a doily once belonging to her grandmother, and reimagines it in Core 10 steel. The original object, saved from a family garage sale, was later lost in the same fire. What remains is its memory, its imprint. And that imprint is transformed into something heavy, industrial, and enduring. The contrast is striking. Lace, often associated with domesticity, care, and femininity, is translated into a material historically tied to minimalist sculpture, a movement often dominated by masculine forms and industrial aesthetics. In doing this, Akashi bridges personal history with art history, questioning what gets preserved, what gets valued, and how those narratives are constructed. There's tension in the work. Between softness and hardness, between fragility and strength, between what is inherited and what is lost. And that tension echoes throughout the Whitney Biennial. This exhibition is deeply concerned with relationships between people, between histories, between materials, and meaning. Akashi's work embodies that idea. It connects the personal to the collective, the intimate to the institutional. The Whitney's architecture amplifies this experience. On the terrace, where light, air, and the city surround you, Monument Altadena feels almost exposed, part of the environment rather than separate from it. It becomes a space you move around, not just look at. And that movement matters, because Akashi's work isn't static. It shifts depending on where you stand, how the light hits it, how you carry your own experiences into it. In the context of the Whitney Biennial 2026, her work becomes more than a reflection on personal loss. It becomes part of a larger conversation about memory, resilience, and the ways we rebuild, physically, emotionally, and historically. You leave her work with a quiet awareness that even in loss, something remains. And sometimes, what remains is transformed into something entirely new. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, the work of Kimowan Metchewais offers a deeply personal and poetic exploration of Indigenous identity. Born in Saskatchewan and a member of Cold Lake First Nations, Metchewais developed an expansive practice that moved between photography, painting, collage, and installation. Beginning in the 1990s, his work emerged during a time when many Indigenous artists were actively challenging imposed narratives and stereotypes. Using Polaroids as a starting point, he transformed images into textured, layered compositions, embracing materiality and process. His self-portraits and landscapes are not just representations, but reflections of lived experience, shaped by what he described as a self-made native imagery. At the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, Metchewais' work stands as both intimate and expansive, reclaiming identity through abstraction and creating space for Indigenous presence on his own terms. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking into the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you immediately sense that this exhibition is expanding what art can be. The Whitney, long dedicated to presenting contemporary American art, becomes a space where disciplines collide, where painting meets technology, where storytelling becomes interactive, and where the viewer becomes an active participant. Curated by Marcela Guerrero and Drew Sawyer, this biennial reflects a moment shaped by complexity, social, environmental, and technological. It brings together artists who are not only responding to the world around them, but actively reimagining how we engage with it. And Leo Castañeda's work is a powerful example of that shift. At the center of his installation is something unexpected in a museum setting, a video game. But this is not entertainment in the traditional sense. It's an immersive artwork that blends painting, drawing, sculpture, and digital technology into a single, living environment. As you step into the space, you're no longer just observing, you're entering. The landscape you encounter is fantastical, but deeply rooted in real places. Drawing from Colombian and Brazilian ecosystems, Castañeda constructs a world that feels both natural and surreal. Lush environments unfold around you, dense vegetation, shifting terrain, spaces that feel alive and constantly in motion. But there's also a dreamlike quality, influenced by Latin American surrealism, where reality bends and transforms. And within this digital world, there's a deeply personal layer. Castañeda incorporates paintings by his grandmother, Maria Teresa Negreiros, into the environment. These works are not simply referenced, they become part of the landscape itself. Her imagery is embedded into the terrain, woven into the visual language of the game. It creates a powerful connection between generations. Between traditional painting and contemporary digital practice, between memory and innovation. As a participant, you navigate this world rather than passively viewing it. You move through the environment, encountering challenges that require interaction. Using mechanics like camouflage and electromagnetism, you solve environmental puzzles and respond to conflicts within the landscape. These actions aren't arbitrary. They're tied to the ecosystem itself, to the idea of adapting, of surviving, of engaging with the environment rather than dominating it. And as you progress, your choices begin to matter. The trajectory of the experience leads toward a cataclysmic explosion, a moment of potential destruction, but the outcome is not fixed. Through interaction, through decision-making, you have the ability to alter what happens. This introduces a powerful idea that within systems, whether ecological, technological, or social, there is always the possibility of intervention, of change, of agency. And this is where Castañeda's work connects deeply to the Whitney Biennial as a whole. This exhibition is concerned with how we exist within complex systems, how we relate to the environment, to technology, to each other. Castañeda doesn't just represent those systems, he places you inside them. The Whitney's architecture enhances this immersion. Moving through the galleries, you transition from traditional works into this interactive digital space. The shift is immediate and disorienting in the best way. You become aware of your own role, not just as a viewer, but as a participant. And that participation changes the experience. You're no longer observing a narrative, you're shaping it. There's also a poetic quality to the work. The blending of his grandmother's paintings with digital landscapes creates a sense of continuity, of histories and practices evolving rather than disappearing. It suggests that even in the most advanced technological environments, there is space for memory, for lineage, for personal connection. And as you leave the installation, that idea stays with you. Because Leo Castañeda's work in the Whitney Biennial 2026 is not just about a virtual world. It's about the real one, about how we move through it, how we respond to it, and how, even within systems that feel overwhelming, we still have the ability to shape what comes next. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking into the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you quickly realize that not all artworks announce themselves. Some are quiet, some unfold slowly, and some exist so subtly within the space that you might not even realize you've encountered them. The Whitney, with its open galleries and constant flow of visitors, becomes more than just a container for art. It becomes part of the work itself. Curated by Marcela Guerrero and Drew Sawyer, this biennial focuses on relationships, how we connect to systems, to environments, and to each other. It's an exhibition that asks you to be aware of your own presence, not just as a viewer, but as someone moving through space, shaping the experience in real time. And Maia Chao's work brings that awareness into focus in a way that is both minimal and deeply perceptual. Her biennial performance doesn't take place on a stage. It happens within the museum itself, specifically in the 7th floor collection exhibition untitled America. There's no clear boundary between performer and audience. Instead, the work is embedded within the everyday rhythm of the museum. At first, nothing seems unusual. People are walking, looking at art, moving from one gallery to another. But then something shifts, subtly. A gesture feels slightly too deliberate. A pause lingers a bit longer than expected. A movement seems choreographed, but almost imperceptibly so. These are what Chao calls micro-performances. They are small, almost invisible actions carried out within the flow of the gallery. Some visitors may notice them, others may pass by without realizing anything is happening, and that uncertainty is central to the work. Because Chao is not just creating a performance, she's rethinking how we experience the museum itself. Her work is based on the choreography of viewing, the way we walk through space, the way we approach a painting, the distance we keep from an object, the pauses, the glances, the rhythms of attention. These everyday behaviors become the material of her practice. Displayed alongside the performance are scores, sets of instructions that invite viewers to participate in these experiments. You might choose to follow them, or simply observe others who may be doing so. Either way, the boundary between artist and audience begins to blur. You become aware of yourself, of how you move, of how others move around you. And suddenly, the museum feels different. What was once a passive experience becomes active. The space becomes dynamic, shaped by the interactions happening within it. Every step, every pause, every glance becomes part of a larger choreography. Within the context of the Whitney Biennial, this work resonates deeply. This exhibition is not just about objects, it's about relationships and systems. Maia Chao's work turns the museum into a living system, where behavior, perception, and presence are constantly in motion. The Whitney's architecture amplifies this effect. The open layout, the visibility across galleries, the movement of people through space, all of it becomes part of the performance. You begin to see the museum not as a static environment, but as something alive, constantly shifting. And what makes Chao's work so powerful is its subtlety. It doesn't demand attention, it doesn't interrupt, instead it invites awareness. You might leave the gallery and only later realize that what you experienced was not just observation, but participation, that you were part of the work, whether you intended to be or not. And within the Whitney Biennial 2026, Maia Chao's practice becomes a quiet but profound reminder that art doesn't always sit in front of you. Sometimes it happens all around you, and sometimes it happens through you. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking through the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you begin to feel how photography can hold history, not as something distant, but as something lived and deeply personal. Mao Ishikawa's Red Flower, Akabana, brings that history into focus. Taken in the mid-1970s in Okinawa, her photographs capture a time when the United States military still had a strong presence on the island, shortly after it was returned to Japan. Ishikawa turns her lens toward women, including herself, who worked in bars frequented by American service members. But these images go beyond documentation. By focusing on Black soldiers, Ishikawa reveals moments of intimacy and solidarity between people who, in different ways, existed on the margins. There's a sense of closeness, of shared experience that cuts across a nationality and circumstance. Within the Whitney Biennial, her work becomes a powerful reflection on history, on connection, and on the ways photography can capture not just events, but relationships that might otherwise be overlooked. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. For film, Whitney Museum of American Art, Margaret Honda installed preset selections of 16 color balancing and 6 neutral density cinematography lighting gels in the museum's west-facing stairwell windows. The gels, which are used to control lighting conditions on a film set, are arranged here according to the manufacturer's numerical order, creating a sequence from top to bottom along the museum's architecture. Over the course of each day, and throughout the exhibition's duration, the colors and their effects change with the light and weather. After sunset, they dim when viewed from inside the stairwell, and at the same time become visible from outside the building. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking into the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you begin to see how artists are reworking history, not as something fixed, but as something that can be reimagined, layered, and brought back to life in unexpected ways. Mariah Garnett's songbook does exactly that. Her experimental documentary is based on a never-performed opera by her great-great-aunt, Ruth Deyo, an American musician who moved to Egypt in the 1920s and remained there for the rest of her life. Garnett takes this almost forgotten story and rebuilds it through a mix of archival material and contemporary footage. What emerges is not a traditional film, but a layered experience. Rehearsals unfold where the original opera's lyrics blend with a contemporary poem. Professional opera singers perform Deyo's score, while new compositions by contemporary musicians reshape the sound. Past and present begin to overlap. There's also a strong sense of place. Garnett incorporates footage from her own research in Cairo, connecting her personal journey to her ancestors' life. Alongside this, Deyo's spiritual writings, her communications with spirits, add another dimension, bringing themes of mysticism, exhaustion, and the search for peace into the work. Within the Whitney Biennial, this piece fits into a larger conversation about memory and transmission. Garnett doesn't just recover history, she transforms it. And in doing so, she creates a work that feels both intimate and expansive, a story that moves across generations, geographies, and time. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking through the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you begin to see how identity is not something fixed, but something constructed, performed, and constantly evolving. Martine Gutierrez's work brings that idea to life. As an interdisciplinary artist working across photography, video, music, and performance, she uses self-portraiture to transform her own body into a site of exploration. In her cinematic, highly staged images, she becomes multiple characters at once, moving between archetypes that feel both familiar and unexpected. There's a tension in her work between reality and artifice. Drawing from family archives and her multicultural background, Gutierrez blends autobiography with constructed narratives, creating images that question how identity is shaped by culture, media, and perception. She references the visual language of fashion, advertising, and mass media, but reclaims it, using it to tell her own story. Within the Whitney Biennial, her work resonates as a reflection on how images define us. By performing every role, artist, subject, and muse, she collapses the boundaries between creation and consumption. And in doing so, she invites us to consider a powerful idea. That identity is not something we simply are, but something we actively create. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, Michelle Lopez presents Pandemonium, an immersive film installation that confronts the chaos of our current moment. Born in Bridgeport and based in Philadelphia, Lopez brings together performance, sculpture, and moving image to explore systems of collapse. Originally staged inside a planetarium dome, Pandemonium is now displayed on a circular screen overhead, surrounding viewers in a disorienting visual experience. The work combines animated imagery of a violent storm with real footage of newspaper clippings swirling through a tornado machine built by the artist. This collision of media and environment reflects a world overwhelmed by information, where truth, fiction, and catastrophe blur together. At the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, Lopez's work becomes both a warning and a reflection, capturing the intensity of media overload, disinformation, and environmental instability shaping contemporary life. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking into the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you begin to notice how some works don't present themselves loudly. Instead, they ask you to look closer, to pay attention to what's usually overlooked. The Whitney, with its open galleries and constant movement of people, becomes a space where even the smallest details can hold meaning. Curated by Marcela Guerrero and Drew Sawyer, this biennial is deeply focused on the systems and experiences that shape everyday life. It's not only about major events or grand gestures, it's also about the quiet traces they leave behind. And Mo Costello's work exists precisely in that space. Her photographs don't capture spectacle, they capture aftermath. A roadside telephone pole covered in staples hints at something that used to be there. Flyers, messages, calls to action that have since been removed. What remains is subtle, almost invisible, but once you notice it, it becomes impossible to ignore. These staples become evidence of communication, of community, of something that once circulated in public space. In another image, shattered glass sits outside a MARTA transit station in downtown Atlanta. At first glance, it could be dismissed as debris, something accidental or insignificant. But within Costello's work, it registers differently. It becomes a trace of resistance, a moment that has already passed, but still lingers in physical form. What makes her work so powerful is this shift in attention. She asks you to look not at the event itself, but at what remains after, the residue, the imprint, the quiet evidence that something happened. And within the Whitney Biennial, this approach resonates deeply. This exhibition is about relationality, about how systems, histories, and communities intersect. Costello's work reveals how those intersections are often recorded not in headlines, but in small, everyday details scattered across the landscape. There's also a strong sense of locality in her practice. Her photographs are rooted in specific places. Georgia, Atlanta, Athens, they carry the texture of those environments, the rhythms of those communities. And yet, the themes they explore feel universal, because traces exist everywhere. In every city, in every neighborhood, there are signs of what has happened, if you know how to look. Another important aspect of her work is the idea of circulation. Costello creates what she calls readers, assembled collections of printed materials that combine her own work with found content. These include reproductions from local archives, essays, coupons, flyers, pieces of information that exist within everyday life. But what's significant is how she distributes them. Not in galleries or bookstores, but in gas stations, pharmacies, and local businesses around Athens, Georgia. These readers move through the same spaces as the communities they reflect. They circulate, just like the flyers that once covered those telephone poles, just like the information that moves through a city. This act of distribution becomes part of the artwork. It extends beyond the museum, beyond the gallery, into real, lived environments. And that gesture connects directly to the Whitney Biennial. This exhibition is not confined to objects. It's about systems of exchange, of communication, of presence. Costello's work embodies that by moving between documentation and participation, between observation and action. The Whitney space amplifies this quiet intensity. Amid larger installations and immersive environments, her photographs ask you to slow down, to shift your focus, to notice what might otherwise go unseen. And in that slowing down, something changes. You begin to see the city differently, to recognize that every surface, every fragment, every overlooked detail carries a story. Within the Whitney Biennial 2026, Mo Costello's work becomes a powerful reminder that history doesn't only live in major events. It lives in traces, in fragments, in the subtle marks that remain long after everything else has moved on. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking into the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you begin to feel how deeply this exhibition is rooted in land, how artists are thinking about place not just as geography, but as history, identity, and lived experience. The Whitney itself, perched along the Hudson River, opens outward to the city and the environment, making you constantly aware of the relationship between the built world and the natural one. Curated by Marcela Guerrero and Drew Sawyer, this biennial explores how we exist within systems, ecological, political, and cultural. It's an exhibition shaped by connection, by tension, and by the question of how we move forward within landscapes that are already marked by history. And Nani Chacon's work brings that question into sharp focus. Chacon, who is Diné, Navajo, and based in New Mexico, creates sculptures that hold a powerful dialogue between tradition and industry. Her work draws visual connections between two very different forms, the sacred imagery of Diné sand paintings and the industrial structures of electrical towers used by coal refineries on the Navajo Nation. At first, these forms might seem unrelated. One is spiritual, ceremonial, deeply tied to cultural knowledge and cosmology. The other is industrial, imposed on the land, associated with extraction, energy production, and environmental impact. But in Chacon's work, they begin to mirror each other. The lines, the geometry, the structure of the towers echo the visual language of sand paintings. What emerges is not a simple comparison, but a layered conversation, one that reveals how these systems coexist, often in tension, on the same land. There's a powerful shift that happens through this transformation. By bringing these forms together, Chacon reclaims the visual language of the landscape. She doesn't ignore the presence of industrial infrastructure, but she recontextualizes it. The towers, often seen as symbols of environmental harm, become part of a new narrative. A narrative that centers indigenous knowledge. A narrative that acknowledges damage, but also resilience. And that sense of transformation is key. Chacon's sculptures don't erase history, they hold it. They make visible the impact of extraction and energy systems on the Navajo Nation, while also asserting the presence and continuity of Diné culture. There's also a spatial dimension to her work. These sculptures are not confined to the gallery. One of the works will eventually be installed on Navajo land after the biennial closes, extending its life beyond the museum. This gesture shifts the work from an object of display to something that exists within the landscape it references. It brings the work full circle, from land to museum and back to land again. Within the Whitney Biennial, this movement resonates deeply. This exhibition is not just about representation, it's about relationship, how artists engage with place, with history, with systems that shape everyday life. Chacon's work embodies that engagement, grounding it in both material and meaning. The Whitney's architecture amplifies this experience. Installed in spaces that open to the outside, terraces where the sky, the river, and the city are all visible, the work feels connected to a larger environment. You're not just looking at sculpture, you're thinking about the land beyond the museum walls. And that awareness lingers, because Chacon's work asks you to reconsider what you see when you look at a landscape, to recognize the layers of history embedded within it, to understand the coexistence of sacred and industrial, of past and present. And within the Whitney Biennial 2026, her work becomes a powerful reminder that even in places marked by extraction and change, there is still the possibility of reimagining the story of the land. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. End of Days consists of scrolling text on an LED display and performances by Nile Harris and Dyer Rhoads. During the live performances, the LED display provides an English translation of the Russian, spoken by a man delivered to the galleries, and uncrated as a work of art. The work reflects on what it means to be collected, a question that is especially relevant for artists working with performance inside of museums, institutions traditionally dedicated to the display and preservation of objects. Dark Brown Birkin Bag is a related work that Harris conceived from a desire to make a Hermes Birkin bag, known for being a collector's item, out of his own skin. Visit Whitney.org B26 performances for a performance schedule. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, Oswaldo Maciá transforms the gallery into a fully immersive sensory environment with Requiem for the Insects. Born in Cartagena de Indias and working between Santa Fe and London, Maciá creates sculpture through sound and smell, shaping space in ways that go beyond the visual. In this installation, speakers hidden inside glass megaphones spiral down from the ceiling, surrounding visitors in a layered sonic experience. The composition blends the sounds of insects with the sharp rupture of shattering glass, unfolding across 16 audio channels. Behind it, paintings inspired by 18th century naturalists' field sketches add a quiet historical reference to observation and documentation. At the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, Maciá's work becomes both elegy and warning, inviting reflection on the extinction of insects and the profound silence their disappearance leaves behind. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, Pat Oleszko brings a playful yet radical approach to sculpture with her signature inflatables. Born in Detroit and based in New York, Oleszko began developing these large-scale works in the early 1980s as a way to challenge traditional sculpture, rejecting heavy materials and rigid structures in favor of something flexible, lightweight, and dynamic. Her inflatables are meticulously sewn in sections, then assembled, unfurled, and inflated, often on her rooftop, before taking on their full, exaggerated forms. Originally commissioned for the World Trade Center Plaza in the 1990s, one such work famously nearly lifted away in the wind, highlighting both the humor and unpredictability at the core of her practice. At the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, Oleszko's work expands what sculpture can be, bringing movement, air, and performance into the conversation and reminding us that art can be as light, unstable, and alive as the world around it. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking through the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you begin to feel how presence, physical, cultural, and ancestral, shapes the space. Some works don't just sit in the gallery, they stand with a sense of weight, history, and continuity. Raven Half Moon Sun Twins does exactly that. This large, three-faced sculptural figure rises on concrete blocks in a gallery window overlooking the water, grounding the work in both the museum and the landscape beyond. Built using a coil technique practiced by the Caddo people for thousands of years, the sculpture carries a direct connection to ancestral knowledge. For Half Moon, making is never an individual act. It's something done alongside her family, her community, and her ancestors, and that presence is felt in the work. The twin forms reflect that idea of shared existence, of continuity across time. The surface is textured, almost alive, and the colors echo the sky at sunrise or sunset, moments of transition. Within the Whitney Biennial, Sun Twins becomes a powerful reminder that art can hold not just form, but lineage, memory, and the enduring presence of those who came before. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking through the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you begin to see how abstraction continues to evolve, how artists expand it beyond the canvas and into time, motion, and technology. Samia Halaby's work is a powerful example of that evolution. Decades into her career as an abstract painter, she began to question how painting could move beyond stillness. Looking at the history of art, she recognized that the most ambitious works have always embraced the technology of their time. So in the 1980s, she turned to the computer. Teaching herself programming languages like BASIC and C, Halaby began creating what she calls kinetic paintings, digital compositions that shift, transform, and move across the screen. Color flows, forms evolve, light becomes active. Within the Whitney Biennial, her work feels both pioneering and immediate. It connects early digital experimentation with today's technologically driven world, showing how abstraction can live not just in space, but in time. And in doing so, Halaby expands painting into something dynamic, a living system of motion, energy, and continuous transformation. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, Sarah M. Rodriguez presents sculptures that transform fragile natural forms into lasting elemental structures. Born in Honolulu and based in New Mexico, Rodriguez begins her process by collecting organic materials, objects like seed pods that carry the potential for growth and change. She then casts these forms in aluminum using sand molds, preserving their shapes while altering their material nature. These individual casts are welded together into abstract compositions, where moments of transformation, accumulation, and time become visible. Alongside her artistic practice, Rodriguez works as an animal trainer, and her sensitivity to patterns of non-human behavior subtly informs the rhythm and structure of her work. At the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, Rodriguez's sculptures hold a quiet tension between permanence and change, capturing the fleeting language of nature in a form that endures. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking into the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you immediately feel how objects carry histories, how even the most familiar forms can hold layers of meaning beneath their surface. The Whitney, with its industrial architecture and openness to the city, becomes the perfect setting for this kind of reflection. It's a space where materials speak, where context matters, and where artists reframe the everyday in unexpected ways. Curated by Marcela Guerrero and Drew Sawyer, this biennial brings together artists who are deeply engaged with transformation, of systems, of histories, and of objects themselves. It's an exhibition shaped by mood and material, where meaning often emerges through subtle shifts rather than direct statements. And Sula Bermúdez Silverman's work captures that transformation with striking clarity. At first glance, her sculptures feel both familiar and unfamiliar. You recognize the shapes: horse stirrups, traps, a bull nose puller, objects tied to labor, control, and the management of animal bodies. These are tools with specific functions, rooted in histories of agriculture, domestication, and power. But then something shifts. Glass has been blown into these iron tools, filling their forms, expanding within them, sometimes distorting their original structure. The result is a hybrid object, part industrial, part organic, part functional, part sculptural. That transformation changes everything. The hardness of iron meets the fragility of glass. The weight of utility meets the delicacy of form. Objects that were once purely functional become something else entirely, something to be looked at, questioned, and reconsidered. There's a tension embedded in these works. These tools were designed to control, to restrain, to direct movement. But in Bermúdez Silverman's hands, that sense of control is disrupted. The glass seems to resist the form, to push against it, to occupy space in a way that feels both contained and expansive. It's as if the object is holding its own contradiction, and that contradiction opens up a deeper conversation. By using found objects, the artist draws attention to the histories embedded within them. These are not neutral forms. They carry associations with labor, with domination, with human relationships to animals and land. But by altering them, by introducing glass, Bermúdez Silverman creates a space for reimagining those histories. The work becomes less about what the object was, and more about what it can become. There's also something deeply visual in the way the glass interacts with light. As you move around the sculptures, reflections shift, transparency changes, and the interior of the object becomes visible in new ways. The glass almost feels alive, catching the environment, responding to it, transforming with each step you take. And within the Whitney Biennial, this responsiveness connects to the larger themes of the exhibition. This biennial is filled with works that explore how systems, whether social, ecological, or technological, shape experience. Bermúdez Silverman's work focuses on objects as part of those systems. She reveals how tools, materials, and everyday forms carry meaning, and how those meanings can be reshaped. The Whitney space enhances this encounter. The industrial quality of the building echoes the materials in her work. The iron, the structure, the sense of weight. At the same time, the light-filled galleries allow the glass to fully activate, creating moments of reflection and transparency that shift throughout the day. You find yourself moving around the sculptures, looking from different angles, trying to understand how they hold together. And in that process, something becomes clear. These works are not just about objects, they're about transformation. About how something fixed can become fluid, about how history can be reinterpreted, and about how, through material and form, artists can open up new ways of seeing what has always been right in front of us. Within the Whitney Biennial 2026, Sula Bermúdez Silverman's work becomes a quiet but powerful reminder that even the most familiar objects can carry entirely new meanings if we're willing to look again. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, Sung Tu presents Systems Void, a work that transforms invisible systems into something physically felt. Born in Vietnam and based in Berlin, Tu often explores how bureaucratic and technological structures shape our perception of reality. In this installation, she translates danger signals from hazardous gas systems at fracking sites across the United States into sound. These signals, normally confined to industrial monitoring systems, are amplified through a large pipe within the Whitney Museum of American Art, turning data into vibration and noise that fills the space. Alongside this, a video projection animates streams of chemical codes, making abstract classifications visible. At the Whitney Biennial, Tu's work reveals what usually goes unnoticed, bringing hidden risks and infrastructures into sensory experience and asking us to confront the systems operating just beyond our perception. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking into the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you begin to feel how the boundaries between the museum and the city start to dissolve. The Whitney, positioned at the edge of downtown Manhattan, has always been connected to its surroundings, but in this biennial, that connection feels especially alive. Curated by Marcela Guerrero and Drew Sawyer, the 2026 Biennial brings together artists who are deeply engaged with movement, through space, through systems, and through lived experience. It's an exhibition that doesn't just exist inside the museum, but extends beyond it. And Taína H. Cruz's work captures that energy in a direct, physical way. Her large-scale drawing, created specifically for a curved wall inside the Whitney, immediately pulls you in. There's something raw and immediate about it. The lines feel fast, almost instinctive, yet at the same time incredibly controlled. And that balance comes from repetition. Cruz practiced this image over and over in her studio, building a kind of muscle memory before executing it on site. By the time she draws it on the wall, the gesture is embedded in her body. The movement becomes fluid, confident, almost automatic. You can feel that in the work. Each line carries momentum. There's no hesitation. It feels like a single continuous act, like something that had to happen all at once. And the curved wall plays an important role. Instead of a flat surface, the drawing wraps around you. It expands your field of vision, pulling you into its rhythm. You don't just stand in front of it, you move alongside it, experiencing it over time. That sense of movement connects directly to Cruz's influences. Much of her work draws from graffiti, the immediacy, the directness, the relationship between mark and surface. Growing up in New York, she associates graffiti with both exhilaration and fear, the thrill of expression, but also the tension of risk, of visibility, of being seen. And that duality is present in the work. There's energy, freedom, and expression, but also a sense of urgency. The lines feel like they exist in a moment that could disappear just as quickly as it appeared. Within the Whitney Biennial, this resonates strongly. This exhibition is filled with artists exploring how identity and experience are shaped by environment. Cruz brings that conversation into the language of the body, into gesture, repetition, and movement. But her work doesn't stop inside the museum. Just outside, at the corner of Gansevoort Street and Washington Avenue, her painting I Saw the Future and It Smiled Back is installed as a billboard. This gesture extends her practice into the public space of the city, returning it to the environment that shaped it. The billboard changes the context entirely. Inside the museum, the drawing is part of a curated exhibition. Outside, the painting exists within the flow of everyday life. Cars passing, people walking, the constant movement of the city. It becomes part of the urban landscape. And that shift is important. Because Cruz's work is rooted in that landscape, it belongs to the street as much as it does to the gallery. By placing the work in both spaces, she creates a dialogue between them, between institutional space and public space, between controlled environment and lived reality. The Whitney itself becomes part of that dialogue. Its architecture, open and connected to the outside, allows these two worlds to overlap. You move from the curved wall inside to the streets outside, carrying the energy of the work with you. And what stays with you is the feeling of movement, of gesture, of presence. Because Taína H. Cruz's work in the Whitney Biennial 2026 is not just about image, it's about action, about the body in motion, and about the power of a single mark to hold the energy of a moment, a place, and a life lived within it. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking into the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you begin to feel how this exhibition reshapes the idea of painting itself. The Whitney, with its open architecture and connection to the city, becomes a space where materials, histories, and environments come into conversation. It's not just about looking at art, it's about experiencing how it exists in relation to the world around it. Curated by Marcela Guerrero and Drew Sawyer, this biennial focuses on atmosphere, on relationships, and on the systems that shape how we live. Artists here are not confined to traditional categories. Painting expands into installation, sculpture becomes environment, and materials carry meaning far beyond their surface. And Teresa Baker's work embodies that shift in a powerful, grounded way. At first glance, her work reads as abstraction, fields of color, texture, and form. But as you move closer, the materials begin to reveal themselves. Synthetic turf forms the base of her compositions, immediately evoking the idea of landscape. It looks like grass, like open land, but it's artificial, manufactured, controlled. That tension is central to her work. Baker is drawn to this in-between space, the space where natural and artificial meet. The turf becomes more than a surface. It becomes a concept. It asks you to question what you're looking at. Is this landscape real or constructed? Is it memory or simulation? Layered on top of this surface, she places materials like yarn, buckskin, and other textiles. These elements introduce a sense of touch, of tactility, of human presence. They feel intimate, almost handmade, in contrast to the industrial nature of the turf. There's a quiet dialogue happening between these materials, the synthetic and the organic, the industrial and the personal, the constructed and the intuitive, and that dialogue unfolds through abstraction. Baker doesn't impose rigid structures on her compositions. Instead, she works intuitively, allowing the materials to guide the process. Shapes emerge, textures shift, and the composition feels as though it's grown rather than been designed. You begin to sense references to landscape, not literal depictions, but impressions, horizons, pathways, open fields. The work holds the feeling of being in a place rather than showing you a specific location, and that feeling resonates deeply within the Whitney Biennial. This exhibition is concerned with how we relate to land, to environment, to systems that define space and belonging. Baker's work contributes to that conversation by grounding it in material. She doesn't need to represent landscape directly. She builds it through texture, through surface, through presence. There's also a sense of scale in her work. Standing in front of these large compositions, you feel enveloped by them. They're not just objects on a wall, they occupy space. They create an environment that you step into, even if only visually. And the Whitney's architecture amplifies this experience. Light moves across the surface of the turf, catching on the fibers, shifting throughout the day. The materials respond to the space, just as the space responds to them. It becomes a dynamic interaction between artwork and environment. What makes Baker's work especially compelling is its subtlety. It doesn't demand attention through spectacle. Instead, it invites you to slow down, to look closely, to notice how materials interact, how textures build, how meaning emerges over time. And in that slowing down, something shifts. You begin to think about the land, not as something distant, but as something constructed, altered, and experienced. You begin to question the boundaries between what is natural and what is made. Within the context of the Whitney Biennial 2026, Teresa Baker's work becomes a quiet but powerful meditation on place, on how we see it, on how we shape it, and on how, even in abstraction, we remain deeply connected to it. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. At the Whitney Biennial 2026, young Joon Kwak presents a work that centers community, transformation, and collective identity. Born in Queens and based in Los Angeles, Kwak creates sculptures using casts taken from members of their queer and trans community. These fragments come together to form what they describe as a collective rising body, a powerful reimagining of the human form as something shared, fluid, and continuously evolving. Their sculpture, Divine Dance of Soft Revolt, is paired with an immersive soundscape titled Soft Revolt Jams Glittered, created in collaboration with musicians from their community. The result is both visual and sonic, an environment that encourages reflection, presence, and connection. With mirrored, glittering surfaces, the work invites viewers to see themselves within it, dissolving the boundary between audience and artwork. At the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial, Kwak's installation becomes a space of affirmation, where identity is not fixed but collectively shaped and celebrated. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next. Welcome to Tarik Talk, a podcast exploring art, culture, and the stories that shape creative lives. I'm your host, Tarik Mendes, and each episode I sit down with artists and creative thinkers to talk about process, inspiration, and the moments that shape who we become. Thanks for being here. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to Tarik Talk. Walking into the Whitney Museum during the 2026 Biennial, you step into an environment where technology, belief, and imagination begin to blur. The Whitney, with its open structure and fluid galleries, becomes more than a museum. It becomes a space of immersion. Each room holds a different atmosphere, and in some cases, a completely different reality. Curated by Marcela Guerrero and Drew Sawyer, this biennial is deeply attuned to the systems shaping contemporary life, social, ecological, and increasingly technological. Artists here are not just responding to these systems, they are interrogating them, exposing them, and sometimes even reimagining them entirely. And Zach Bloss's work does exactly that. His installation, Cultus, is part of a larger trilogy titled Silicon Traces, which explores the ideologies driving the tech industry's pursuit of power and control. But rather than presenting this critique in a straightforward way, Bloss constructs an entire world, one that feels at once futuristic and strangely ancient. As you enter the space, it doesn't feel like a traditional gallery. It feels like stepping into a kind of digital temple. The installation is immersive, filled with moving images, sound, and presence. Large-scale video projections unfold across the room, created through computer graphics and motion capture performance. Figures appear, shift, and dissolve, existing somewhere between human and machine, between body and code. There's a sense of ritual. Musicians and actors populate this environment, performing within the installation as if participating in a ceremony, and layered throughout are lyrics and sermons, texts generated in collaboration with AI systems. These voices echo through the space, creating a rhythm that feels both technological and spiritual. Bloss is exploring a powerful idea here, that the language and culture surrounding artificial intelligence often mirrors religious belief. There's talk of transcendence, of superintelligence, of systems that might surpass human understanding. And in Cultus, these ideas are taken seriously, but also questioned. The installation imagines a pantheon of AI gods, not as literal deities, but as symbols of the ideologies shaping the tech world. These figures represent a belief in domination, in optimization, in a future controlled by systems that promise perfection, but may carry their own forms of power and exclusion. And within this constructed mythology, there is also resistance. Bloss introduces what he describes as a heretical presence, something that disrupts the system from within. It's not always visible, not always defined, but it's felt. A tension, a break in the logic of the system. And that tension becomes central to the experience. Because Cultus doesn't offer a clear answer. It doesn't tell you whether to believe or reject these technological futures. Instead, it places you inside them, allowing you to feel their pull, their seduction, and their unease. Within the Whitney Biennial, this work connects deeply to the exhibition's broader themes. This biennial is about relationships between humans and systems, between bodies and technologies, between belief and reality. Bloss's installation brings those relationships into sharp focus, revealing how deeply intertwined they have become. The Whitney's architecture amplifies the experience. The darkened gallery spaces heighten the immersion, while the movement between rooms creates a sense of transition from one world to another. You leave one environment and enter another, carrying the energy of the previous space with you. And after spending time inside Cultus, you don't leave unchanged. There's a lingering question about what we believe in, about the systems we trust, and about the future we are collectively building. Because in the Whitney Biennial 2026, Zach Bloss's work doesn't just reflect the technological moment we're in. It asks what happens when that moment begins to feel like a form of faith. Thank you for spending this time with me on Tarik Talk. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and share the episode. You can follow along on social media for behind-the-scenes moments, guest highlights, and what's coming next.